Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. I am Christine Burdell. I am the Director of Alumni and Donor Services at the McCombs School of Business, and I'm really happy to see you all tonight. Professor Spellman is in the Finance Department at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin, and he is the author of the Spellman Report, which is an online blog that analyzes the intersection of where the economy, economic policy, and financial markets meet in order to interpret current and future trends from the perspective of history, theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lou Spellman.
Sorry for the academic stuffy intro. It's not on? No, this is what, just recording. I think we're good. Okay, so no mic, all right. Okay, thank you all for coming out. Many familiar faces in the audience. This is not a McCombs alumni event, but basically I put a bug in their ear that I really did want to get up and I had a message. And the message really is, after watching these events and being involved all the way back from the 1960s on, we're in a really major change in the economic and financial environment. And everything you learned at UT, you can throw out the window. I stopped by the co-op to look at the textbooks, and the textbooks are still drumming in the old standard Keynesian ideas, but basically they are bankrupt. They're at the end. They're totally finished. They don't work. Zero impact. So let me go through and give you an indication why and why you come to that conclusion. What really struck me that caused me to call up Christine and ask if we can do an alumni event is the incredible disconnect that's going on in the economy and the financial markets. We have financial markets that are exuberant, they're priced with very high PEs, very high bond prices with very low yields, the same thing in real estate. So financial prices are exuberantly priced. At the same time, the economy is dragging along. And typically, having taught this for probably, 40 years, that the pricing in the financial markets are supposed to be a reflection of the earnings that are coming along associated with the growth of the aggregate economy, and it's not happening. There's a total disconnect, and it was caused me to have to really think this through. Most of you in the audience are old school, like myself, where basically you take a look at the growth rate of the economy, and from that you get a sense of the earnings growth of companies, and it changes the valuation of stock prices. But we're not. Basically, the relationship between stock prices and the economy is almost broken. So part of the discussion tonight will be, here's what I plan to do. It's a three-part discussion. I can't get it all into one. The three parts are, tonight is the cause of the slow growth economy. The second one, a week from tonight, same place, same time, what's behind the financial market exuberance despite the economy being so sluggish. And the third one is, what do you do today as a private investor, investing in this unusual environment of expensive assets and soft economic growth? It's inconsistent with what we learn, what we've seen, what we've experienced all our lives, and what's in the textbooks. So what could possibly be at the bottom of that is what this three-part series is about. First night is the cause of the slow growth economy. They are linked, by the way. There are linkages among the three. The slow growth economy, believe it or not, ended up resulting in policies being taken to support asset prices. So basically there is a relationship between the slow growth economy and the exuberant financial pricing. Okay. So that's my plan. Before I get going, let me, for those of you who are alumni and not, some of you folks are from, came as a result of me announcing this on my blog, but for those who don't know, I have been doing this the Spellman Report for about, actually it started with the financial crisis of '08. And in this very room, as a matter of fact, I had probably 24 former students call and ask me, what's causing the financial crisis of '08? So I decided, look, I'm going to give one big lecture. And we put out the word to the alumni, and this started this blog, which I never had any thought of ever doing. And once I did those 4 lectures on the financial crisis, my dean said, you can't stop now. So basically here we are like 9 years later, and it's actually growing and growing. The subjects keep changing, but basically they have to do, as Christine said, it's the intersection, as you can see, between the markets and the economy. Not very many people are in that intersection, in the sense that as an academic taking an econ PhD, the econ departments didn't deal with finance. I have 2 degrees in finance, and they don't deal with the economy. So there are very few people that live in the intersection. So that's where I am, and that's what this is about, is the relationship between the two, and they do obviously relate. Okay, so the blog is about every 6 weeks or so, and it doesn't jam your inbox, and it's a freebie. So basically, you go to the Spelman Report if you'd like to get it, just put in your email in the upper right-hand corner, and it comes whenever I get one out. On average, it's about 10 a year, 9 or 10 a year, something like that. Okay, so basically, this is the layout of where we're going with this. Tonight is the cause of the slow growth economy. My last blog, I couldn't help but take the logo for my last blog. By the way, the logo is very important. It sets out the theme of what that particular blog will be about. It's basically it's an analog of what I'm trying to say, and it's a lot easier to say it in an analog and do it in 1,000 words than do it in 5,000 words without an analog. And my last blog had to do with the cause and extent of the slower and lower economic growth. And I have to come up with a logo, and it occurred to me, I had just recently seen the movie Sully, and I imagine a fair number of you have as well. The whole idea of the event, and it was a real event, an airplane, a U.S. Airlines airplane taking off from LaGuardia, and flew into, they didn't fly into, they hit a flock of birds, and the birds basically took out the engines. And so here they are climbing out of LaGuardia with Manhattan down below on their left. They have absolutely no power. And so they're trying to apply power, restart the engine, and basically they're getting no thrust whatsoever. And this, to me, feels like the economy. They have put as much power as they possibly can into the economy, and I'll give you some idea of how much stimulus they have done, and basically it has not responded. So it feels very much like the Sully economy. The good news with this particular experience is he landed, the pilot Sully landed on the Hudson River very safely, and actually all passengers and crew were saved. And only 1 or 2 got wet who panicked and jumped into the water. So basically, it feels like the Sully economy. As much thrust as they give it, it goes lower and slower, lower and slower. And that has been the pattern. And I'll show you the pattern and advance some ideas why that might be the case, what the cause is of the slower and lower. Now, when Bernanke, as a policymaker, when faced with a Great Recession, throws massive monetary stimulus, and I'll give you an idea how massive. I mean, it's like 30 times more than we've ever done. Not 30%, 30 times. So basically, they threw everything they had at it, and basically nothing would happen. And his usual press conference answer to the question of why is this not working, and his usual way is what you would usually say, we're heading into headwinds. We have headwinds out there, and mysterious headwinds. And he would never say what they are, but basically that's what this is about. What are the headwinds where they could apply massive fiscal and monetary stimulus and nothing happens? And he doesn't want to admit, as a policymaker, that it's not working anymore. He can't do that. It's both an intellectual thing on his part, but it's also, as a policymaker, you can't stand up in front of the crowd and say, all our tools are no longer functioning and we have no remaining role. So he's in an awkward position, to say the least. So it became headwinds. We're into headwinds. Okay, so that's what this is about. We're not hitting birds, but we're hitting headwinds. And what are those headwinds? Okay, now to give you, the main theme is our growth rate in the U.S. economy is, and this comes out of post-World War II, when they first started to analyze business cycles, and the Federal Reserve and the government had a mandate from Congress to eliminate business cycles. And basically, and I'll give you the thrust and I'll give you an idea of how they look at it and what they try to do. But this is the result. The result is this is the growth of an economy coming out of the bottom of a recession, just when you should be growing the fastest, coming out of the bottom, heading back up to normality. And so basically this, what we see is the 1950 is here on the left. We were at 7.6% growth. And this is, by the way, in real terms growth, 7.6. And then we had a little dip here at 54. That's Eisenhower. Then we had all these expansions coming out of business. These are the business cycles since World War II. And this is the upswing out of the bottom of the business cycle. But you can see every cycle, which, by the way, would be about every 4 or 5 years, something to that effect. And we see 5.6, 4.9, then we get to the 4s and the 4s, and then the 3s and the 2s, and this last one where we threw so much stimulus at it, and we can't get past a 2% growth rate. And we've been staggering along at a 2% growth rate now for, I guess, since '08, something like that. So basically, it obviously, the tilt is downward. We're getting less bang for the buck, so to speak, every single cycle recovery. It's kind of ominous because basically, what it's basically saying is the ability to grow is declining. Our growth capacity is declining, even when they're trying to throw as much at it as they can to stimulate the economy. Okay, so basically, the question then becomes, is the lack of growth a demand problem or a supply problem? And I've heard this analyzed hundreds of times both ways. There are an awful lot of folks who look at the withering capital stock of the U.S. I mean, you and I see it in terms of, let's say, infrastructure. We see infrastructure crumbling, particularly in the metropolitan areas of the old East, back, in New York area. So basically, it's not just the infrastructure of the public sector, but also the private sector. The plants, equipment, basically, we're starting to look like a third world country. And so there are an awful lot of people who are pointing to the reason for the slow growth is the supply side of the economy. But I don't think that's the case at all. Basically, if you don't have demand, there's no reason, and an expectation of an advancement of demand, there's no reason for businesses to be borrowing money, build new plant and equipment, put money into R&D to get more output in the future if they don't think the output's coming. So basically, the supply side is withering, but this, in my estimation, is a result of the lack of demand. And so basically we're starting to look, I don't want to say like Venezuela, but we're heading in those directions. That's a little extreme, I know, Rudy. But anyway, so the point is we got two issues. Is it the demand side or the supply side? An awful lot of people point to the supply side, but I think it's erroneous because that's a reaction to the demand side. And the demand is measured, and when I say demand, let's make sure we're on the same page. Demand is spending by all sectors. And spending by all sectors is called GDP, gross domestic product. And basically that's exactly the same as income because every dollar spent gets paid, income derives to every factors of production, labor, capital, rents, etc. So when we're talking about GDP, we're talking about both spending and income, and we use them interchangeably. So demand measured by all spending units is lacking, and you'll see. Supply is a very interesting issue. When you took the macro course, and even up to today in the macro textbooks, they don't indicate what the supply side is of the macro economy. It's a very interesting concept, and it tells you an awful lot, and I'm still astounded that it's not in the textbook. Basically, it's something called potential GDP. Potential GDP is a man-made estimate, and it was actually, the first one was done by Art Oken of Yale University, who I had the privilege and honor, really, of working with. He ended up being Carter's chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors. Art, we have this mandate of generating economic activity, but you only want to do it, and it's up to the point where you're not creating inflation. And you want to do it sufficiently that you're generating enough economic demand so that we have full employment. So basically, the problem became, this was a difficult problem for the policymakers. In the early, let's say, 50s and 60s, they were faced with a bit of a problem. In 1946, Congress passed the Full Employment Act, and that was coming out after the Great Depression. Then we had lots of employment during World War II. When the war was over, they were deeply concerned we're going to go back into depression. So Congress legislated the Full Employment Act in 46. So basically directing, prior to that act, the federal government never intervened in trying to manipulate or change the course of the economy. That's the first time they had a mandate from Congress to do so. Then they had to figure out the tools by which they do it and how to adjust those tools to achieve two objectives. And Congress, it took them a while to figure out what the objectives would be. And the two main objectives were do not allow the level of unemployment to get, and the way they actually implemented it is don't let unemployment get past 5%, okay? They didn't go down to zero. Because if you go down to zero in terms of unemployment, you're stimulating the economy to the point where you have inflation. So basically they ended up with two goals of policy. It took them a while to figure it out before Congress figured it out, and it took a while for the policymakers to figure out how to manipulate the economy such that you don't rev it up so fast that you get inflation. On the other hand, you don't let it go down so far that you have unemployment. So they ended up having to have a target that was a happy medium between the two. And that ended up being what potential GDP is. Supply is measured by potential GDP. It's an estimate of how much GDP can be produced using reasonably full employment of labor. 95% is how they defined it. Capital, 80% of capacity utilization. And then they had to figure out what obviously trend. The other input to it was productivity, which is the result of a lot of R&D. But they didn't have a goal on that. But basically they had to have a level of GDP to shoot for that was not too high to generate inflation and not too low to have unemployment. So that's what potential is. And here's a very extraordinarily rough, and I'll show you some actual estimates of potential. Basically, this is how the two relate to each other. The cyclical, this is GDP spending. And the business cycle, we have booms followed by busts, followed by booms, followed by busts. And these boom periods, you tend to have inflation. And they wanted to know how much of a boom can we have without having inflation. So that's what the measure of potential is. It's a man-made estimate that they have to run through, and they have to refine the equation year after year. But basically, potential ends up looking like this constant growth rate. And if the economy pierces it, goes above it, you're now having low levels of unemployment. You're using wage rates rise. You're having less efficient production by the workers. Costs rise. And basically, you end up with inflation. Then on the other hand, if you go below potential, you're now in the unemployment area. You've gotten rid of inflation, but you now have unemployment. So basically, what they're trying to do is take GDP and get it to merge and coincidentally grow with potential. That will get them to the happy medium between inflation and unemployment. So basically, that's the objective of economic policy, is to try to get the cyclical moving demand side to match the potential GDP. And basically, I'll tell you, it's a control theory type of operation. I'll tell you what, to give you a better idea. It's like trying to, we send up space. We used to land on the moon. So the moon is a moving target. So you send a rocket up for a soft landing on the moon, and basically what you're trying is you're chasing a moving object through space. And you have to catch up with it and then tangentially land with it. And that's what they're trying to do. So they're trying to get the demand to catch up to potential, but not pierce it and go beyond it, but just tangentially reach it and stay there. Have they ever done it? Well, fairly close a few times, very few, but very few. But what I do have to say is, and I don't have it in the deck of graphs is that if you take a look at the business cycle expanses from 1790 up until 1946, the ups and downs were huge. The cycles were very large. The up cycles and the length of the depressions were very long as compared to the period of time thereafter. If you compare the two, basically they flattened out, you know, the ups and downs of the economy. They haven't done it perfectly, for sure, but on balance, they've done a very, very decent job of cutting out the extremes on either side. That is up until the Great Recession, up until the situation we're in now. So basically, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get GDP when you're below potential to catch up to it. And that's, you're down here in the bottom of the recession, you want stimulus to catch up to it, but you've got to remove the stimulus somewhere along here so that you don't overshoot it, okay? Which, by the way, becomes a very politically difficult thing to do because you're removing stimulus and there's still unemployment. And then having sat through some congressional hearings, not where I was being grilled, but I was the guy on the side always supplying the data. Basically, any congressman will say, you're trying to tighten monetary policy, and in my district I still have 48,000 unemployed. So basically it becomes very, very difficult to really do it without having some political pressure. But nonetheless, on balance, they've done a decent job with it. So that's what that is the framework of policy. Okay, now let me show you how it gets implemented. Let me see if I've hit all these points. Legislative guidance for macro policy is to avoid the inflation side and the unemployment side. By the way, it's not just monetary policy, it's also fiscal policy, because Keynesian economics indicated that the tools that we have to work with, and this all comes out of his book, which was written 80 years ago this year, in the Great Depression, in the middle of, I think, 1936, really in the depths of the Great Depression, he wrote the General Theory, which said, look, we don't have enough spending, but the government would have some tools, and the two tools are borrow money and spend. In other words, create demand out of borrowed money. And they could also manipulate monetary policy to encourage people by reducing the interest rate and causing folks to have better terms of borrowing as an inducement to spend, borrow and spend. So the two Keynesian tools to right the economy were both based on debt. And that's where I'm going with this whole discussion tonight. Monetary and fiscal policymakers attempted to close the GDP gap to potential and then track with potential thereafter. In recessions, they closed the gap by fiscal and monetary policy. In the Great Recession, which I'm going to really focus on most, my recollection is we had two $700 stimulus bills. That's a lot, 1.4 trillion. The size of the economy at the time was probably about 15 trillion. So we're talking about almost 10% of additional borrowing and spending, if you go back 10 years ago. So basically that's mega fiscal policy. And monetary policy, you know what happened. It's still on the front pages, it's still in the headlines, called QE, quantitative ease. They increased the monetary base. Typically, a typical year increase of the monetary base was 4% of the money outstanding. When the Great Recession began, we had 800 billion of currency outstanding. So 4% of 800 is 32 billion. So instead of doing a $32 billion stimulus, they did a $3 trillion stimulus. I'm not sure what, that was 1 year. The usual would have been about 30 billion. And they did, over the course of about 4 years, 3 trillion. So basically the monetary base went from less than 1 trillion to over 4 in a very short order. And did we get anything out of it? Very little. Very, very, very little. So basically, that's monetary policy on steroids. Never happened before. They had to come up with a name for it, and that's where you see quantitative ease. As a matter of fact, the Fed preferred that name because everything else in the newspapers was compromising on the Fed. Outrageous monetary policy. So the Fed had to give them a title, quantitative ease. They're not thinking about interest rates anymore. They're just thinking about the quantity of money. So they were trying to get to change the language of the discussion. and successfully. Quantitative ease, and they did $3 trillion, over $3 trillion, actually $3.5 trillion, on a base of 0.8 of 1 trillion. So basically, and very little has happened. The lending that you all were walking, you know, I'm talking to a Macomb School of Business graduates, and up until a few years ago, it was a required course that everyone took money in banking. So I would imagine some of you might know what the money supply multiplier is, where when the Fed prints money and buys bonds, and then the money gets deposited with banks and it becomes free cash reserves for the banks, they generally, in the good old days, with the money supply multiplier, it used to be 8. In other words, if the Fed bought $1 of government bonds, the commercial banks would respond with $8 of loans to the private sector, from 1 to 8. That now is almost 1 to 1, or 1 to 1.5. So the multipliers that you learned about for fiscal policy and monetary policy no longer exist. And there was a lot of reason for the banks not to respond with lending given the cash reserves they had. But part of it has to do with re-regulation, where they were forced to raise capital, deleverage, and basically they still have an extraordinary overhang of liquidity for which they can increase the money supply, the private money supply, some major multiple, some very, very large number, but they're not doing it. So the question is, why are the banks not doing it? Why is the lending not occurring at the bank level when the banks have the cash? Well, in that market, you got a lender and a borrower. So it's either one or the other or both of them. And it turns out it's both of them. And basically what I'm going to go through a bit tonight is the willingness of the consumer sector to continue to borrow. Actually, they've been deleveraging. They've been paying off net, which is another thing that slows the economy. Okay, so in any event, the economic policy making sort of worked pretty well. Certainly, the effectiveness was declining, but it didn't decline almost to zero until this Great Recession. Now, this gives you an idea of the picture. Imagine this is a very good analysis and really shows you the setup. The top line is potential GDP estimated in 2007, which is when the onset of the Great Recession began, 2007. So based on that man-made estimate at that point, you see how high the level of GDP was supposed to be. The dotted line is the actual spending. And what you see is deviations. And this is 2001, so we were still in the tech boom. And during the tech boom, the spending was greater than potential. The economy was doing well. Then when we get into the tech bust, it's not very far down. You can see, I'm not sure percentage-wise, it's usually 2%. You go into a recession. All you really do is fall 2% and you're in a recession, in a normal recession. And so you see they're slightly below the target in the tech bust years. And then we get to the housing boom years and we're slightly above the target, not far off. And then we get to the Great Recession and suddenly GDP falls into a hole. The decline was, I think, 7.5%, creating a gap of 7.5% with GDP. So that's huge. You might not think that's such an alarming amount, just lose 7.5%, but then you do have an awful lot of people become unemployed, and there's an awful lot of decline in wealth, and basically it's a major political event, it's a major economic event. 7.5% is huge. So this is the Great Recession, and they decided to throw everything at it. Well, what you see is the response to it. It falls down to the bottom in 2009, and then we get to a lower level of GDP, and then we start growing off of that, but we're at a lower and slower growth rate. It's both lower and slower, like the airplane, like Sully's airplane. You kept going slower, which caused them to go lower. So basically, even with all that stimulus, we're making hardly any headway getting back to the old potential. As a matter of fact, what starts to happen is a new dynamic that we've never seen in the post-war period, is that you have such deficient spending relative to the supply capability. That's machinery, that's trained workers, et cetera. You got a very large gap. So basically, why invest as a businessman? The expectation, if your expectation is that the recovery will not be strong, I'm certainly not going to borrow and indebt my company and build the latest new machinery, increase the have technology change, get the latest update, and increase my productive capacity for the next boom. Well, it went down so far they lost their confidence and they quit doing it. So basically, they sat there with the old machinery clunking along, and then what we started to find when we went back, and as a matter of fact, this growth of potential from 1960 up until about 2007 was so consistently 7% a year, they quit estimating potential. They just extrapolated. And then they started to realize that basically factories are getting shut down. There's not very expensive having an open plant that's not functioning. You have insurance costs, you have tax costs, you have the costs are great to preserve a closed plant. As a matter of fact, it's about 20% of the plant value per year to preserve and protect. You have to have not only insurance, but you have to have around the clock guards, or else they're vandalized. So basically, we started to dismantle our productive capacity. And what happened is when they go back and re-estimate it, what they found in 2011, which is the first time they went back and re-estimated, that the potential is growing far less than they projected 4 years ago. And every year since, they do a new projection now of potential, and every year it's lower and slower. Not only is the base lower, but the growth rate is lower as well. So basically what we have is a situation in the economy, and you can now understand why an awful lot of people who are looking at slow growth in the U.S. start to look at the supply side. You know, we're having a productive capacity that's ancient. So this raised the question of where are we? Is this a supply side problem or is this a demand side problem? And actually what we are now finding out is, which is reasonable to expect, that businesses will not expand their productive capacity unless they have an expectation of having demand for their products. Why build product and create inventory if you don't think you're going to sell it? And so basically we now have a situation where the demand level is leading to a response on the supply side. So far we're sitting here with this ancient plant and equipment. That's beginning to change, but basically we are in this problem. Okay, so the gap and here's the gap. The gap is the difference between actual GDP, which is down here, and potential. It goes by the name, quote, the gap. How much below potential are we? How big a gap? How much should we throw at demand into the mix to try to get up to potential? So basically what they found was that they were getting no bang for the buck. Basically, I've been through this. Let me move on. Aggregate demand grew tepidly and the gap remained. They threw all kinds of fiscal and monetary policy at those extremes I laid out. It turns out the deficient demand also lowered producers' inclination to spend on expanding plant and equipment. There's less spending on R&D, less labor training, and it's really showing up in our labor force now dramatically. And then in turn it pulled down the growth rate of the economy's productive capacity. So basically that's the hole we've gotten into. Now this shows it. Potential supply, interestingly, when you go back from a policy perspective, when you're facing this situation, what you try to do is throw much stimulus at the spending side to reach potential. And the way you get rid of the gap is by having demand catch up to potential. But reality is that potential is collapsing to demand. Instead, we've never had a situation like that before. Here it is. This is the latest Fed numbers, or these are the official numbers. The blue is potential, and the red is aggregate demand. And you can see when aggregate demand fell so far below in the Great Recession, we've grown at about a 2% rate. Potential used to grow at 3%, but now it's collapsing into that 2%. We're getting close to it now. We're getting close, but only because the supply side is collapsing into the demand side, which used to be just the opposite of the way the tangential relationship used to work. So that's our situation. Now, the growth path of potential has been reduced. Years later, debt, now the question is why? What's going on? So far, this is a description of what's happened. Now the question is why. It turns out that there's an opposite side or a flip side of extreme fiscal and monetary policy. Keynes talked glibly about, and all the textbooks do, and I must confess that early in the days when I used to teach this, I went along with the textbook. Basically, you borrow and spend, and all of the focus was on the spending, creating round after round of additional spending as people get paid, and they go and those who get paid, you know, let's say the government borrows money and builds a rocket. They pay their workers, and then the workers get their salary, and they go out and buy lunch. So you have multiplier effects. So whoever is running the lunch wagon now has income. So you have round after round after round of multiplier effects. And it turns out that all the focus was on the rounds and rounds of spending, but no focus was given whatsoever. And actually, I've gone back to the Keynesian book, his own book. Basically, he never accounted for the growth of debt that takes place as you go through this process of fiscal and monetary policy. It's borrowed money to spend. And all the textbooks only talked about the spending side, gave no recognition, no accounting whatsoever of the debt buildup that takes place. And basically, that's the heart of where I'm going with this discussion tonight. Basically, it turns out that the debt buildup is so enormous, and it creates future problems. And the future problem is that with debt, you have to service debt. You got to pay interest, and in some cases, principal. So that means it takes away from future income, because whatever our future income is, we can only spend net after we pay our debt service. And it turns out that that's true for us individually. Actually, you and I as a consumer understand this problem better than the government does, and that's the truth. Basically, you borrow money, you have debt service that cuts into future income. It turns out that the after debt service of future income is declining so much that basically once they borrow the money and spend it, they're not getting the additional rounds of spending, and the debt just keeps bleeding future income, so they're not getting the second and third and fourth round spending levels that they used to. So basically, years later, debt is accumulating faster than income, and I'll show you the numbers. They're really, they're pretty clear how the extent to which this is happening now. Now we have a debt service bill to be paid each year in the future. The debt service takes away from future net income after debt service, so the debt load reduces spendable future income. We have this notion called disposable personal income, but it doesn't include debt service. Disposable is after taxes. But basically, the debt with an interest carry is like a tax. It's a debt tax. You borrow money in the first period, you got to take some of your future income and pay either principal or interest or both. So basically, we have really two taxes. We have a federal tax and we have a debt tax. And someone who doesn't understand it is called the federal government. And I'll show you the size of it and what's happened. Now, interestingly enough, the consumer understands it and the businesses understand it, although I think right now they're overborrowed tremendously and they're ending up having to delever in the future as a result of it. But the point is, past debt acts as a debt tax on future spending, and private parties tend to understand that. By the way, the good news is I looked at the numbers for the state and local governments. They have reined in their borrowing tremendously because of the debt service has hit them. A lot of states are now going to zero deficit status. Ohio did it. There's still few that are, like California, that is running deficit after deficit, but they'll be reined in. And we'll have to talk about who can maintain that and why can the federal government continue to maintain more and more debt and still be able to borrow on the same terms of debt. And that's where an important part of this. Basically, the federal government is not disciplined by the market. You and I as a consumer, we're disciplined by the market. If we have too much debt, the lender says no, and the financial markets say no to California, you know, the states that have too much debt outstanding. So here we are. We've had a debt buildup, and basically this is a picture you shouldn't forget. This is the rising debt to income ratio. It's not this is by country, and it's not rising debt. It's the ratio of debt to income. In other words, the level of debt relative to the ability to service the debt. So this is the strain. This is the strain of debt relative to the ability to service it. If I just showed you the picture of debt buildup, you would expect that to happen as time goes on, the numbers get bigger, but this is the relationship of the debt to income changing. In turn, what does that do? Well, if debt to income changes, and if interest rates are constant at whatever rate, that means the debt service to income rises. So a bigger and bigger proportion of our future income, it gets washed away in terms of interest service. And I'm not even talking about principal yet. I'll get to principal. So basically, look what's happened. And this is a post-war period of all the major countries of the world. Japan is the leader in this race. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. The Eurozone is second. The U.S. is third in terms of the relationship of debt as compared to the ability to pay for it. And you do see here with the U.S. in 07 our total. Now, by the way, this is what this is not just government debt. It's government plus private debt, plus government plus corporate, plus personal, plus state and local. So we have this decline in the U.S. in the last few years, and that mainly has to do with the consumer after the housing boom and bust, either paying off their debt or defaulting on it, one or the other. So basically, that's the only reprieve we've had, but I'll show you the U.S. government separately from the total. But basically, it looks like we're the only one that so far has had any discipline. Canada, Australia, they track along with us at lower multiples. And the most interesting is China. Look at China coming in like a rocket. And this is the debt to income, not the level of debt, the debt to income. And it all starts in 07. And can you imagine why? What happened in 07, we obviously had a major worldwide Great Recession. Europe, the United States, Australia, Canada, everywhere. So basically they were looking for one country that could serve as the leader of generating demand to buy products from other countries. They got a name for it. Oh, it's the kind of the locomotive of the train of recovery. So basically they actually talked China into, since they had a clean balance sheet and they had the possibility of borrowing and spending and create a lot of demand and buy products from the rest of the world, and basically they were going to enhance our economy in the hopes that it would revive our economies, and we kept buying products from them. So basically they thought it was in their best interest to basically serve as the locomotive of the system with debt financing. And look at that, they went straight up. I mean, that's a rocket. That's 07 to now, so we're talking about 10 years, 1 decade. They did that. And now they're heavily indebted. The consumers are heavily indebted, the businesses are heavily indebted, and the governments are heavily indebted. Not as indebted as we are, but basically they blew it. They had clean balance sheets and growing, and that's the way to stay. But there was a meeting in Washington, the G20 countries, or maybe even 30, you know, the major developed countries of the world, and they all turned to China. It was a meeting at the IMF saying, okay, you're the leader now. Now you got to support us. And and they were basically, their ego, I think, got out of control. I think that's, you know, they appealed to the ego of China. You're in a position to save the world, and basically the economic world. And they bought on it, which is kind of unheard of for the Chinese to do that, but they did it. So, and they turned on monetary policy, and they made, at that point, they were still controlling the banks. They were still state-owned banks. So they started lending enormously, and then the government borrowed and spent themselves. really foolish on their part, but nonetheless they did it. Most foolish thing I've seen them ever do. But look where we are. The upward drift, not just the level, but the upward drift of debt relative to the ability to pay it. So it's not just a U.S. problem. It's a European problem. I mean, last spring we were expecting an Italian a default on government debt. It's obviously going on in South America. Basically, it's a worldwide problem, debt to income in any place that matters. So this means that the debt service slows foreign economies and it interacts with ours, because if they're slow growing, they buy less product from us and vice versa. So it's self-reinforcing. All right, now how about the government debt? Let's just look at the government debt by itself. This is the government, U.S. government, debt to income of the U.S. government alone. The other was the federal government, the state governments, the public and private.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So did China borrow to buy U.S. debt?
No.
Because didn't
Oh,
China
no.
have a lot of cash sitting
No,
there?
I'll get to that next time. Basically, their foreign exchange reserves bought it. They didn't borrow. No, they didn't borrow from us. No, if anything, they spent the money on our debt. They probably borrowed from their own financial system and their banks. Okay, so anyway, here's the U.S. situation. This is not the total amount of debt. This is the relative amount of debt. Debt relative to your ability to service it, debt to income. I think the numbers are, and I should have looked it up, but off the top of my head, I believe the numbers are that in 2008, when Obama was sworn in, I think we were at about 10 trillion of debt. When he left office, we were at 20 trillion of debt. So we had about a doubling of debt in 8 years as compared to the accumulated debt from 1790 to 2008. So that's over 228 years, we got to 10 trillion, and then they added 10 trillion in his 8 years. So that's the extent of the debt ramp up. But this is the extent of the debt to income ramp up. And that's not quite double. We went from about like 62% here. That's about 62.3% here. Now we're at 107%. We're at 100%. So 62, it's a little less than double because we had some income growth. So the ratio of debt to income has not quite doubled because we've had some income growth. But basically, we have really put ourselves in hot water as a result of doing this. Now, one thing I didn't get into the slide deck was discussions of when do you get in, quote, the red zone of danger for a country when they're too indebted where they can't pull out. This is the R&R study. It came out in about 07, 08 of defaults that have taken place historically. And basically the outcome of this incredible, you have to work for the IMF to be able to do this. You have to have a large staff and a lot of data. And they took all the country defaults that they could find and the data for it. And basically they came out on average that once you got past 90% of debt to income, then the whole thing starts to unwind. And that's when you end up with country defaults. The U.S. has passed the 90% level. And it should be for reasons. We have far greater borrowing capacity now, and that's the question. How much more can we add? Actually, that's our problem. We can add it too easily. The market is not constraining the U.S. It does constrain, for example, Venezuela, Brazil, et cetera. Most other countries do get constrained by the market. If they're going to borrow too much, then the rate that the lender demands is a reflection of the risk, and the rate goes up. So the borrower borrows less. So there is automatic market discipline. We hope it's perfectly automatic. In our case, has not happened at all, and we can talk about why it's happened. They give us, the United States, far more slack than any other country. And you might say, how about rating agencies rating U.S. government debt? Well, I believe 2 of the 3 have downgraded U.S. to AA from AAA. And I believe both of them ended up having the Justice Department after them for some trumped up charge for doing so. And that's the truth. They went after, I can't remember which one. Bruce, do you remember? Is it S&P or one of them downgraded the U.S. and then the Justice Department went after the CEO and he resigned. And it was all on fraudulent lending having to do with the housing boom, not the government. So basically the government doesn't care for you lowering the credit rating. So and that's the way they are. They want full control, be able to finance what they need to finance at very low rates of interest. After all, the 10-year I think was 2.1 this week. So basically, we have extraordinarily low interest rates in the country, despite this debt-to-income ratio. Extraordinary, which unfortunately gives us more incentive on the part of Congress every time we have a problem to just go borrow the money and put the patch on that problem without any regard to the cumulative effect of the future interest cost, not in total, but as a percentage of future income. And that's what this next graph is. Well, no, it's not the next one. Sorry, let me just get, well, let me go back here. Here it is. Let me go forward. This is the cost. And then I have to go back on those other slides to give you an idea how much we've borrowed. What you see here is, let me interpret this for you. The blue line over time is the revenues to the Treasury. The red line is total spending. And basically what they were looking at in this particular study is how much of our total spending is the debt service on past borrowed money. And that's the pink stripe. So basically, here's where we're going in the future. These are the revenues, at least, you know, a lot of assumptions have to be made at today's tax rates. These are the non-interest expenditures of all kinds in this, I guess, what color is that? It's kind of a bland color. So here's the gap. Here's our deficit just for buying stuff. Medicare, Medicaid, aircraft carriers, space moonshots, whatever. So we're running a deficit that's getting larger just on goods, but then if you add in the interest service of existing debt and projected debt, and that's the pink layer. So the pink layer out here gets, we have to eyeball it back, and it looks like mid-20s to 30. It looks like 5% of GDP. The interest service is where we're headed. 5% of future income just paying the interest on the federal debt, even at these 2% rates for the 10-year. The 1 year is, what, less than 1, right, Milam? I'm sure it is. I'm trying to find someone trying to survive on short-term debt. I'm sure it's less than 1. So basically, what we're heading toward is a 5% share of future income just to cover the interest. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but basically look where we are on debt. Now, here's the question. How do you pay for that? Either raise taxes, which slows the economy, or borrow more money to pay interest. Well, you all as consumers understand if you have to borrow to cover your interest, how quickly the interest bill climbs relative to your income. We're at that point. We're at that point where we have to borrow to pay interest. And it's growing, and the amount is growing. The whole pink layer is the amount that has to be borrowed to pay interest. Amazing. Now, let me go back, and that's the implication of what they've done. So let me go back to where we've been. Here we are. This is what I was trying to show you. Here's the debt to income ratio. Give you an idea of what's coming in terms of more debt. We not only have a problem of past debt creating interest service in the future, we got another problem called entitlements. This is the annual deficit. Anything below the line is deficit. Believe it or not, we did have 3 years under Bill Clinton of running a surplus, which is what we are going to have to do if we want to deleverage this thing, or at least stop borrowing. So this is the tech boom years. And then this is George W. Bush years when he shouldn't have been borrowing because we were doing well enough. That was a really big mistake. And then this is the Great Recession. Look at the size of the order of magnitude of these numbers. This is 1.2, 1.4 trillion a year of borrowing. To give you a frame of reference, our total GDP is 20. So 1% of 20 is 5%, so we're borrowing an awful lot, 5, 6, 7% a year of GDP relative to GDP. So this was the Great Recession years, the effect of the expansionary fiscal policy on debt sold. That's what this is, the debt bill, federal budget balance. The only way you can cover negative is borrow. So basically, now here's the other thing that is extremely, I'll say troubling or impossible. What we have in black, and we have growing deficits projected totally as a result of the demographics and the entitlements, age-related entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, in place. So basically, the demographics are such that the baby boomers, the leading edge of the baby boomer generation just turned 70. So basically, every year from now on, the entitlements grow and grow and grow, and they grow quite a bit. So that's just simply, that's a projection. That's not my projection. That's the Congressional Budget Office. So basically, that's their projection of where this thing is going. So we're looking at borrowing on the same of the 1.4 trillion, 1.2 trillion, et cetera. And with a GDP of 20, 1 over 20 is 5%. So basically, we're adding so much more per year. So basically, now here's the real conclusion of this. This one tells me more than any of these other graphs. The annual increase in debt in red and the annual increase in income to support the debt. Ever since 07, here's where we get in the Great Recession. This is debt, and we had a negative income spike during that recession. But ever since then, the debt far exceeds the growth of income to support the debt. Every year you're getting further and further in the hole, deeper and deeper. So it also implies something else. The multiplier, being Macomb's graduates, if you want to, with debt increasing more than income every year, it means $1 of financed spending should cause both debt and spending to rise by $1. But we're not getting that. We're not getting the income to rise even equal to the debt. Basically, you're borrowing the money, you're spending it, and total income doesn't go up that $1. You borrow $1, you spend it, you're $1 further in debt, you spend the $1, but the total income at the end of the year is not even $1. So we're having a negative effect. This is a negative multiplier, GDP multiplier. So the more borrowed money, we end up with less outcome in total, not relative, but in total. And this has been going on now for 10 years. Look at this. This tells you where we're going. This is really outrageously out of control. The debt rises more than income every year, which means the multiplier of fiscal policy has to be negative. The total effect is lowering income. You don't even get the $1. You borrow $1, you build an aircraft carrier, and you don't even get $1's worth of income because of all the other things that you got to pay, like interest, among others. So basically, we're now going in the hole at an accelerating rate, at a huge accelerating rate. We've never been there before. And basically, the textbooks still say the multiplier is positive, and I really do want to go over, how aware is the government of this? They've shown no sign whatsoever of being aware of it. So here's the point, our conclusion. Keynesian remedies of debt-financed spending really has hit the wall. And it's not just hit the wall where you get no effect, we're getting negative effects. We're actually getting negative effects from it. It's lowering income. Every $1 borrowed and spent generates less than $1 of income when everything is taken account of. So basically we have, and by the way, the latest academic studies on the multiplier itself, which is a very, it requires an econometric model of the economy and estimating a lot of equations to come up with all the effects of A affecting B, affects C, affects D, et cetera, in a simultaneous model. The problem with that is you can run those models, but you can only run it on past data. but the past data was based on the relationships that existed in the past. So we don't have really an ability to come up with an up-to-date multiplier that's fully fleshed out in an econometric model where they have an equation for every variable in the system. That's the way to do it. That's the hard way of doing it. That's what I started doing. But you know, you can't do much. The government has missed so badly their estimates, the Federal Reserve in particular. The Federal Reserve constantly is talking about, you know, the uplift that their monetary policy is going to provide. They've been wrong every year, every forecast since '07. And basically, they go back and they study it more. The only way you can study it more is to go back and get more data. But they're getting data from the past when the responses were different. So there's no way they can really grapple with it in their way of doing it. Econometric models as a forecasting device is basically worthless, because all you can do is do the estimates based on past relationships, but the relationships have changed. So you don't have anything to work with. That is a reflection of today. And the Fed keeps trying, and they're wrong every single time, embarrassingly so, every time. You know, they give estimates of the future income growth as a result of monetary policy. They've been overshooting it every quarter since '07. And they just won't stop. They're better off not saying anything. I mean, they're better off not showing their ignorance. But in any event, long story short, we got a problem. The problem is, and the problem is not just the multipliers don't work and the Keynesian tools that used to work. And by the way, when did they work? When we had clean balance sheets. They really worked World War II. During World War II, for example, the government had a very clean balance sheet. And the private sector had a very clean balance sheet. So when you don't have this debt overhang where you're having to devote so much of your future income to debt service on past borrowing, then it does work. So we did have big multipliers during World War II, the few recessions coming out of, you know, immediately after World War II. But I showed you the first slide is the amount of recovery per recession recovery has diminished and diminished and diminished. And that's because we have the debt that keeps accumulating on the balance sheet. So anyway, the Keynesian solution doesn't work. So the question becomes, when are they going to recognize it and realize that what they're doing is putting us underwater? That's not easy. One way you can ignore it, the United States has been able to ignore it. The reason we've been able to ignore it is the U.S. government is still able to refinance existing debt and continue to be able to finance additional debt without market discipline. They're not raising the rate, saying there's a sovereign risk associated with U.S. government debt. The market is accepting our debt. Why? How unanalytical are they? Well, they accept U.S. Treasuries. On the face of it, it looks good. Why does it look good? We never had a default. That's the first thing they go to. The default history. Well, our past is too pristine. It allows us to get in trouble. So they don't discipline the U.S. Now, there have been few times some countries have sold off U.S. But actually, when George Bush was president and we had a big deficit coming out of Reagan-Bush, and remember he said, watch my lips, no new taxes. And we had about 8 years of big debt buildup because they didn't want to raise taxes to expenditures. The market actually started to discipline the U.S. Treasury. We had about a 200 basis point sovereign risk in the market rate for our treasuries. When Bill Clinton gets elected, within minutes, literally, because Bill Clinton, as a Democrat, surprisingly said, I'm going to balance the budget. And he did more than balance the budget, he ran a surplus. So basically, the market responded with about 150, as I recall, 150 basis point reduction in the U.S. Treasury rate that they could borrow because they thought they now had a president who understood fiscal discipline. So basically, that was one of the few times we ever got priced. But right now, as compared to the alternatives, we are still the best in the world. And if you have market debt, and particularly Treasury debt, it's very liquid. You can sell it and be out of it in a minute. So they think they're covered because they have an immediate response button. And that's why they keep going with it. as well as our past history that we've never had a default. So we have this huge amount of debt, and it's going to grow as you see. I don't know at what point the market is going to say no more, no mas, but it's going to happen. Now, so the federal government is still able to refinance existing debt, continue to be able without market discipline. Private debt is another story. The consumer actually, since the Great Recession, has actually net paid down debt, has deleveraged. And you might say that's wonderful. That is wonderful on the debt overhang story, but while it's happening, it means they're spending a smaller and smaller percentage of their income. So we're getting less economic stimulus. So basically, we're doing it at a cost. When you deleverage, it's at a cost. You have less income today. So the consumer did it, and it was a combination of both their lender saying no more and the borrowers themselves saying we don't want that overhead ourselves. And on top of that, there was another adjustment which got rid of the debt, which is they actually had a lot of default on the housing debt, which got written off. So basically, the consumer has been through it and delevered. Now the corporate sector has had a celebration over these extreme low interest rates from QE, and I should have looked up the numbers, but they've had a big, big expansion of leverage in the consumer sector in the U.S., and that's going to be a problem. Junk bonds in the next 2-3 years are going to be a big problem. If the economy slows down, a lot of these junk issuers have to go back and get refinanced, and if they're going to get back to get refinanced during a slower growth economy, they're going to find their rate went from 4 to 8, and then they can't afford 8, and there are a lot of defaults that come out of it. Yes?
Back to the federal for a moment. Have we learned anything from the Japanese? I mean, they're 20 years further down this rabbit hole than we are. They have lower rates. The currency hasn't collapsed. They showed that this could go a lot longer than we thought.
Well, I'm getting to that. The question is, how can you sustain it? And they're the leaders of how to sustain it because they got there first.
18 years ahead of us.
Well, I'll get to it. I'll get to it very soon. All right, deleveraging has occurred in the consumer sector. Now the question is, how about the corporate sector? The corporate sector got a dose of reality with the tech bust, and they went through a huge deleveraging for several years. And with these very low interest rates, all kinds of firms borrowed, and basically they not just borrowed to build plant, and obviously very little of it for plant because we didn't have a gain in potential GDP. Most of it was financial, basically levering up the company to buy their stock back, which is one of the reasons why stock prices are so high, because they altered the capital structure. They levered themselves, borrowed, added debt to their balance sheet, borrowed money, and with the funds, bought their equity back out of the markets. So basically they levered up the capital structure and reduced the shares so that earnings per share rose. And that's one of the reasons we're looking at high earnings per share, because of the reduction in the number of shares outstanding. But so the corporate sector hasn't this time yet faced it, but it's going to have to. Now Japan, here's your question. If you're faced with this problem and you're sitting in the Treasury and you got to sit there and scheme, how the hell am I going to support all this debt? And that's what they do. That's what they do. I was there. That's what they do. How are we going to do this? What are the options we have? Well, number one, put it on the balance sheet of the central bank. You need a buyer. The most timid buyer is the central bank. Basically, they get called in and say, you are to buy this debt. But you don't ever tell the public we're out there to buy the debt, because we got to support the price. Now, the dynamics of calling the central bank is you have two parts to it. You want to have the central bank buying to keep the price up, and the flip side of it is to keep the interest rate low, and they need a low interest carry. Okay, so the central bank gets called in, and it's very easy to instruct them to do it. How do they pay for it? Literally print money. The only cost of doing it is the cost of the paper. That was PR, Bruce, and you bid on that hook. He said, we send a check, we don't print money. That's what he said. Okay, so the first thing you can do is put it on the balance sheet of the central bank. Now, are you going to announce publicly, we're going to try to handle our debt problem by pushing it off on the central bank and instruct them to do it? Well, hell no. If you tell the public that you're in trouble, they're going to dump the bonds. They own the bonds as well. So they'll dump the bonds. So you need a cover story. And the cover story is we got a big recession, and we got to support the economy with more Keynesian policies. And how far have they pushed it? They've pushed the price up not just to par, but above, not in the secondary market. They pushed the price not just to par and not just 1 year's interest, not just, let's say, 2 years interest if it's a 2-year bond. They pushed the price beyond principal and all interest for the life of the bond, and that's how you get to something called a negative interest rate. That's how high they pushed it. So the central bank with unlimited resources, which is currency, basically they have pushed the price of government bonds to have a negative interest rate. It's mind-blowing. So basically you got to figure out a cover story to cover this one up. And you got to somehow get the press, you got to confuse the press, because the press really indicates why it's happening and what's happening. Basically, no one else would buy it. So basically, you have to put out a cover story. It's our stimulus policy. We're going to support the economy. Everything's good ahead. It's basically, you got to lie. You got to lie and cover it up and create impressions. Bernanke had the same problem with his QE. He had the same, PR problem of not just to the public, because the public doesn't vote for Fed chairman. He had a big problem because his public was the bond market, and he didn't want them to flee. So they had to continue to feel that they're comfortable, that everything is still in order and things are going well. Whoops, what happened here? There we are. There it is. No, we were there. Yeah. Japan. Let's see. Is this not working? I can use. Okay, here we are. Here's where we were. Japan. Answering your question. Think about Japan. They got into their Great Recession a lot earlier than we. It was like 1990. And it didn't happen because of housing like it happened here. Basically, the emerging markets came on. China came on, basically took their export market away. So they went from a very fast-growing modern economy to a stagnant, zero-growth economy, and it all had to do with trade. They lost their competitiveness in trade compared to China and these other countries of Asia.
One big difference between Japan and the U.S. is that in Japan, most of the public debt is held by the Japanese public. In the U.S., about $8 trillion of our federal debt is held by foreigners.
Yeah, yeah. Morris has been. Thank you. He's been pointing something out that's very valuable. Let me get to it. I'll get to it in a little bit. Basically, the first go-to supporter of government bonds is the central bank. You got to come up with a cover story, and it has to be convincing enough, or you have to have foolish enough reporters. That's number one. Then you have to have a high savings rate. And if you have a high savings rate, it goes under the title in economics called financial deepening. If you have a high savings rate, the accumulated savings relative to income is higher. The U.S. has the deepest financial. I think we're at 90 trillion of private wealth relative to 20 trillion of ongoing income. So our financial deepening is very high compared to other countries. So if you have a lot of assets out there, private assets out there, then a smaller percentage of private assets gets you further as the government. So basically, then how are you going to try to get private asset holders to hold Treasury debt at 2% with risk? You got to figure out some way to do this. One way they do is usually make it tax-free. Foreigners, believe it or not, If they buy Treasury debt, foreigners, it's zero. It's like a muni, no interest, no U.S. interest whatsoever. They don't even take the Social Security. They don't even take your Social Security or tax ID number. U.S. Treasury debt has zero tax for foreigners. So that's another way to do it. You got to make it more desirable. So you got to save a lot, and then you got to force people to buy it or induce them to do it. The fourth one is recruit foreign capital, no tax on U.S. Treasury. And as Morris points out, it's a losing game because to the extent foreigners own U.S. Treasuries, it also means that we get into a situation that we're in today where I hope I say it correctly, if not you correct me, we own less foreign debt. Foreigners own more U.S. debt than we own foreign debt. Big time. Big time. So basically, we've had the situation where we're used to own, the U.S. asset holders held more foreign assets than they held of America. Now it's turned around. And as he says, big time. So in the short run, it looks like it's a wonderful deal. We got all this debt. Can we cram it down China's throat? That's what W thought, President Bush. That's what he thought. What are they thinking? Because basically, if China holds a good lion's share of our debt, we got to pay taxes to the U.S. government, and with our taxes, our income goes to China to run their government. Idiots. I mean, really. Serious. They thought it was a great deal if we could push this on China. As a matter of fact, they induced China to do this by turning the other way on violations of trade agreements or trade. They allowed them to break the rules of trade, and we would turn the other way as long as you use the proceeds to buy treasuries, which gets you through that year of having a deficit. You have a buyer in hand to buy your debt, but in the future, you and I have to service that debt with our income. And basically, it means lower tax rates in China and higher tax rates in the United States. Idiotic. So basically, when you're trying to put a patch on a tire that's leaking air, it gets you into a lot of trouble in the future. And that's they very very short-term oriented. Let's just get through this crisis. Okay, the other way to do it. The Spellman report, "The Game is Rigged" for U.S. Treasuries. That was a blog I wrote about a year ago, and this is an amazing, an amazing way to get rid of U.S. Treasuries. Find buyers.